Betrayed by their own children, an elderly couple is left to survive a deadly blizzard with nothing but a thin, tiny old tent. What happens next will shock you. It's got everything you need, Kyle was saying, gesturing to the tent bag like it was a gift. Poles, stakes, the whole kit. I used it for a camping trip maybe 10 years ago. Should still be good. Harold looked at his son. Really looked at him. Kyle was 42, wearing a Patagonia jacket that probably cost more than Harold's last 3 months of groceries combined. His house behind him was 3 stories of modern architecture, all glass and sharp angles. 2 SUVs sat in the driveway. A boat trailer was visible beside the garage. I wish we could do more. You know we would if we could. But Brittany and we've got the kids' private school tuition, the second mortgage, we paid for your college, Evelyn interrupted. Every penny. We took out loans on the house to cover your business when it failed the first time. Your father worked doubles for 3 years straight so you could have your start. I know, Mom, and I'm grateful. But that was a long time ago, and things are different now. The economy, the market, you have a boat. The words hung in the cold air like breath made visible. Kyle's jaw tightened. That boat is an investment, for family time, for the kids. Harold placed his hand on Evelyn's arm. Not to silence her. After 51 years of marriage, he'd never tried to silence her, but to steady himself, to keep from saying things that couldn't be unsaid. Where's this campground? He asked. Kyle looked relieved. He pulled out his phone and began tapping. I'll text you the directions. It's about 40 minutes outside town, up toward the national forest. Beautiful area, really. Peaceful. Harold turned the word over in his mind. He'd spent his whole life being peaceful, believing that if you raised your children right and gave them every advantage you never had, they'd be there when you needed them. He'd been a fool. The drive took longer than 40 minutes because Harold had to pull over twice. Once when his vision blurred, a lingering effect from the stroke that his doctors had warned him about. And once when Evelyn started crying so hard she couldn't breathe. They sat on the shoulder of a mountain road, their ancient Honda Civic ticking as the engine cooled, while Evelyn pressed her palms against her eyes and shook with sobs she'd been holding back for months. 42 years, she said through her tears. 42 years we gave them, everything we had, everything we were. Harold reached across the center console and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. They were always cold now. The arthritis had gotten worse since they'd lost the house, since the stress had started eating at her from the inside out. I know, he said, because what else was there to say? Derek sold our house, Harold. Our son sold the house we raised him in. He forged your signature on documents. He took everything and left us with nothing. I know. And Melissa won't even answer her phone. Her own mother calls, and she sends it to voicemail. 3 months now. 3 months of silence. I know, Evie. The twins said they'd visit us at assisted living. They said it was the best decision for everyone. They said, her voice broke, they said they loved us, and then they just stopped coming. Stopped calling, like we were already dead, like we weren't even worth the effort of pretending anymore. Harold squeezed her hand and said nothing. There was nothing to say, nothing that would make any of it make sense. The children who had once clung to them with such fierce love, who had promised in the uncomplicated way of the young that they would always, always be there. Promises. What were they worth? The Social Security checks came to $2,887 combined. The cheapest apartment in their town started at $1,200 a month, not including utilities. Harold's medications ran another $400 after Medicare. Evelyn's arthritis treatments, another $200. Food, gas, the few remaining bills that followed them even into destitution. By the time everything was accounted for, there was nothing left. Less than nothing. The assisted living facility where the twins had deposited them had lasted 3 weeks. Then the administrators had called a meeting, their faces arranged in professional sympathy, to explain that the family's promised payments had stopped coming. Unfortunately, without continued financial support, alternative arrangements would need to be made. Alternative arrangements, that's what Kyle's tent was. An alternative arrangement. The campground was empty when they arrived. Harold hadn't expected otherwise. It was mid-November in the Colorado mountains. The summer families were long gone, the fall hikers had retreated to warmer places, and only the desperate or the lost would be out here now. He parked the Civic in a pull-off near a clearing that looked relatively flat. The ground was hard with frost, the grass brittle and brown. Pine trees surrounded them on three sides, their branches heavy and dark against the graying sky. "This is it?" Evelyn asked. Harold looked at the clearing, at the mountains rising behind it, at the thin ribbon of road that was their only connection to the world they'd known. He thought about Kyle's text. "Beautiful area. Peaceful. You'll love it." "This is it," he confirmed. The tent was worse than he'd expected. The canvas was thin, far too thin for winter camping. It had been designed for summer trips, for weekend getaways when the worst weather you might encounter was a brief afternoon thunderstorm. Several seams showed signs of wear, and there was a patch near the base that looked like it had been done with duct tape years ago. The poles were aluminum, lightweight, meant for easy setup. Harold's hands shook as he tried to fit them together, and twice he dropped sections into the frozen grass. "Let me help," Evelyn said. But when she bent to pick up a pole, her knees protested so loudly that Harold could hear the joint pop from 3 feet away. "I've got it," he told her. "Sit in the car. Stay warm. I'm not going to sit in the car while you, Evie. Please." She looked at him for a long moment. 51 years of marriage had given them a language beyond words. She saw the pride in his eyes, not the stubborn, foolish kind, but the fragile sort that was all he had left. The need to do this one thing, to build this pathetic shelter with his own 2 hands, to feel, for just a moment, like he was still capable of protecting her. She went to the car. It took Harold an hour to get the tent up, an hour of fumbling with poles and stakes, of pausing to catch his breath, of fighting against hands that wouldn't stop trembling, and a body that had never fully recovered from the stroke. By the time he was done, the sun was touching the mountain peaks, and the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees. The tent sagged in the middle. One corner didn't quite sit right, creating a gap where cold air would seep in. It was barely 8 feet across, enough room for 2 sleeping bags and nothing else. Harold stood back and looked at his work. This was what 42 years of sacrifice had earned them. This was the retirement they'd been promised by a lifetime of honest labor. This thin canvas shell in a frozen clearing, miles from anyone who cared whether they lived or died. He thought about the house on Maple Street, the kitchen where Evelyn had made Sunday dinners for 25 years, the back porch where he'd taught Derek and Kyle to throw a baseball, Melissa's old bedroom, still painted the pale pink she'd chosen when she was 12, the living room where the twins had taken their first steps, one after the other, always together. All of it is gone now, sold by their own son to cover debts he'd accumulated through carelessness and greed, signed away with Harold's forged signature on documents he'd never seen. Derek hadn't even had the courage to tell them himself. They'd learned about it from a lawyer's letter, delivered to the assisted living facility 3 days before they were asked to leave. Harold wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The cold had made them water. That was all. They'd brought sleeping bags from Kyle's garage, summer weight, like everything else, and spread them inside the tent over a thin foam pad that did almost nothing to block the cold, seeping up from the frozen ground. They'd worn every piece of clothing they owned, layered one on top of the other, and still the cold found its way in. Evelyn's teeth chattered. Harold could feel her shaking beside him, her thin body curled into a tight ball as she tried to conserve heat. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, giving her what warmth he could, which wasn't much. "Tell me something," she whispered into the darkness. "Tell me a story. Something warm," Harold thought. His mind drifted back through the decades, searching for a memory that might hold some heat. "Remember our first apartment?" he said finally. "The one on 14th Street, with the radiator that clanked all night. The landlord said it was charming. It was freezing. That first winter, we'd wake up and see our breath inside the bedroom, but we had each other. We did. And that ugly orange couch your mother gave us." Evelyn laughed, a small sound, but real. "God, that couch. I was so embarrassed when anyone came over. I loved that couch. You did not. I did, because it was ours. Because we sat on it together every night after I got home from work. Because that's where you told me you were pregnant with Derek. The memory settled over them like a blanket, thin, like everything else they had now. But something. We were so scared, Evelyn murmured. We had nothing. No savings, no plan. Just two kids pretending to be adults. But we figured it out. We did. We always figured it out. She was quiet. For a moment, then, will we figure this out? Harold didn't answer right away. The honest response would have been, I don't know. His medications were running low. The propane for their small camping stove would last maybe another week. The sleeping bags were already proving inadequate, and the real cold, the deep cold, the killing cold, hadn't even arrived yet. But 51 years of marriage had taught him that some truths didn't need to be spoken. She knew the odds as well as he did. She knew that Kyle's tent was less a gift than a sentence, that their children had sent them out here to disappear quietly, to solve the problem of their existence through the brutal mathematics of exposure. We'll figure it out, he said. It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. But it was the kind of lie that two people tell each other when the truth is too cold to survive. Harold and Evelyn developed routines because routines were all they had. They woke with the sun, not by choice, but because the cold made sleep impossible once the deepest part of night had passed. They ate what little food they'd brought, canned soup heated over the propane stove, crackers that grew staler by the day. The last of the peanut butter scraped from a jar that had traveled with them through 3 temporary homes. Harold walked each morning. Not far, he didn't have the strength for far, but enough to keep his blood moving, to remind his body that it wasn't dead yet. He'd circle the clearing, then venture a few hundred yards down the access road, then return to find Evelyn waiting by the tent, her eyes searching his face for signs of distress. The stroke had left him with a slight drag in his left leg and an occasional blurring in his vision. The cold made both worse. Some mornings he'd return from his walks and have to sit for 20 minutes before the world stopped swimming. But he kept walking, because stopping felt like surrender. Because as long as he was moving, he was alive. Because Evelyn needed him to keep moving. She, in turn, did what she'd always done. She made things work. She organized their tiny space with the efficiency of someone who'd raised 4 children on a steelworker's salary. She rationed their food, calculated their propane usage, figured out that if she heated water and poured it into empty plastic bottles, they could use them as makeshift warming pads in their sleeping bags. "Where did you learn that?" Harold asked, the first time she showed him the trick. "My grandmother," she said. "During the war, they did what they had to do." Harold watched her work and felt something that might have been hope, or might have just been gratitude that he wasn't facing this alone. But the cold was relentless. By the 4th day, Evelyn's hands had grown so stiff she could barely grip the handles on the cooking pot. Her arthritis, which had been manageable with medication and warmth, flared into something savage. She moved like someone made of glass, terrified of shattering. By the 6th day, Harold ran out of his blood pressure medication. He didn't tell Evelyn. What was the point? There was no pharmacy out here, no doctor to write a new prescription, no money to pay for it even if there were. He simply started each morning hoping his heart would keep its rhythm for one more day. By the 8th day, the first real snow came. Harold woke to a weight on the tent. For a confused moment, he thought he was back in the house on Maple Street, that the heavy pressure was just Evelyn's arm across his chest, that the cold was just a dream he'd wake from any second now. Then he opened his eyes and saw the canvas bowing inward, inches from his face. Snow. Heavy snow. So much that the tent's thin poles were straining under the load. "Evie," he shook her gently. "Evie, wake up." She stirred slowly, her movements sluggish in a way that frightened him. When her eyes finally opened, they were glassy, unfocused. "Cold," she murmured. "So cold, Harold." He struggled out of the sleeping bag, every joint screaming in protest, and began pushing at the canvas from inside. The snow resisted, packed dense and heavy. He pushed harder, feeling the strain in his shoulder, in his chest, in the weak left side of his body that never worked quite right anymore. Finally, The tent wall shifted, and a small avalanche of snow slid off the exterior. Harold heard it thump to the ground, felt the canvas spring back to its normal position, but when he turned around, Evelyn hadn't moved. She lay in her sleeping bag, eyes half closed, shivering in a way that seemed almost mechanical. Her lips had a bluish tint that Harold recognized from his safety training at the mill. Hypothermia. Early stages, but there, Evie. He knelt beside her, took her face in his hands. Her skin was ice. "Evie, I need you to stay awake. Can you do that for me?" "Tired," she whispered. "Just want to sleep." I know, honey, but you can't sleep right now. You have to stay awake." He fumbled with the propane stove, his own hands shaking so badly he could barely manage the igniter. 3 tries, 4, 5, finally, a flame. He put water on to boil, wrapped Evelyn in every blanket they had, and talked. He talked about their wedding day, about Derek's first steps, about the vacation they'd taken to Yellowstone when the kids were young, all 6 of them crammed into a station wagon that broke down twice on the way home. He talked about Melissa's graduation, about the twins' baseball games, about Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, and all the small, ordinary moments that had made up their life. He talked until his voice went hoarse. He talked until the water boiled, and he'd filled every bottle they had. He talked until Evelyn's shivering slowed, and her eyes came back into focus, and she looked at him with something like herself again. "Harold," she said, "I'm here. We're going to die out here." He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her another warm story, spin another thin comfort against the cold. But he'd run out of lies. "Maybe," he said. She reached for his hand. Her grip was weak but present. "I'm glad you're with me," she said. "Whatever happens, I'm glad it's you." Harold squeezed her fingers and said nothing. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The snow fell for 2 days. Harold lost track of time somewhere in the middle of it. Day and night blurred together into an endless gray twilight, punctuated only by the need to clear snow from the tent, to boil water, to keep Evelyn warm enough to survive until the next hour. He stopped eating on the 2nd day. Not a conscious decision. There just wasn't enough food for both of them, and Evelyn needed the calories more than he did. She was smaller, frailer, and the cold had hit her harder. So Harold heated soup and crackers for her, told her he'd already eaten, and ignored the hollow ache in his stomach. The propane ran out on the morning of the 3rd day. He'd known it was coming. He'd watched the flame grow weaker over the past 12 hours, the blue tongue shrinking until it barely flickered. When it finally died, the silence it left behind was worse than any sound. No more hot water, no more heated bottles, no more warm soup, just the cold, patient and absolute. Harold. Evelyn's voice was stronger than it had been. She'd improved over the past day, her color returning, her eyes clearer, but it still carried a tremor that had nothing to do with temperature. "The stove. I know. What do we do?" He looked at her. 51 years of marriage, and he'd never once failed to have an answer when she asked him a question. He'd always found a way, always figured something out. That was who he was. Harold Mitchell, problem solver, provider, the steady hand that kept everything together. Now his hands were empty. "I don't know," he said. The words cost him something. He felt it leave his body like heat escaping through a crack in the tent wall, some essential part of himself that had kept him going all these years. The belief that hard work and good intentions would always be enough. The faith that the universe rewarded those who tried. Evelyn reached for him. Her hand found his in the dim light of the tent, and she held on. "Then we wait," she said simply. "We wait, and we pray, and we see what happens. I stopped praying a long time ago. I know. I'll pray for both of us." The sun came out on the 4th day. Harold woke to light, actual golden light, streaming through the canvas walls. For a moment, he didn't understand. The world had been gray for so long that brightness felt foreign, almost threatening. Then he heard the sound. An engine, distant but growing closer. The unmistakable rumble of a vehicle navigating the snowy access road. Harold sat up so fast his vision swam. He pressed his hand against the tent wall, steadying himself, listening. The engine sound grew louder, then stopped. A door opened and closed. Footsteps crunched through snow. "Hello?" A man's voice, deep and cautious. "Anyone here?" Harold scrambled for the tent's zipper, his numb fingers fumbling with the frozen metal. By the time he got it open and stumbled outside, a figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, surveying the scene with an expression Harold couldn't read. The man was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, tall and weathered, with a gray beard and eyes the color of pine bark. He wore a heavy canvas jacket with patches on the elbows and carried a walking stick that looked hand-carved. A truck sat behind him on the road, old, mud-splattered, but solid. "Good Lord," the man said quietly, taking in the sagging tent. The snow piled around it, Harold's gaunt frame wrapped in inadequate layers. "How long have you been out here?" Harold tried to answer, but his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. 8 days. 9, maybe. Lost count. The man's expression shifted. Something flickered behind those bark-colored eyes. Not pity exactly, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Understanding. "Is there anyone else with you?" "My wife. She's inside." Harold's voice broke again. "She's not doing well." The man was moving before Harold finished the sentence. He crossed the clearing in long strides, his walking stick punching holes in the snow, and ducked through the tent's opening without waiting for permission. Harold followed, his heart hammering. Inside, Evelyn had pushed herself up to a sitting position. She looked startled, afraid, a stranger in their space, in this vulnerable moment when they had nothing left to protect themselves with. But the man's voice was gentle. "Ma'am, my name is Samuel. Samuel Thornton. I'm a retired forest ranger, and I'm going to help you. Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Evelyn's eyes darted to Harold, then back to Samuel. "Cold," she whispered. "Tired. My hands." She held them up. Her fingers were swollen, the knuckles red and angry. The arthritis had progressed beyond anything Harold had seen before. Samuel examined her hands with a careful, practiced touch. "How long since you've had your medication?" "I ran out," Evelyn said. "Days ago. I don't know how many." "And you?" Samuel turned to Harold. "You look like you haven't eaten in a while." Harold shook his head. The denial was automatic, protective. "I'm fine." "No," Samuel said quietly. "You're not. Neither of you are." He stood, his head brushing the tent's low ceiling. "I'm going to get some things from my truck. Stay here. Don't try to move." He was gone before Harold could respond. Samuel returned with supplies. Not just supplies, a small miracle, carried in his weathered hands and an old canvas bag that had seen decades of use. A propane tank, full. Canned food, the good kind with pull-top lids. Thermal blankets that crinkled like foil but held heat like nothing Harold had ever felt. Hand warmers. A first aid kit, 2 pairs of thick wool socks, and coffee. Actual coffee, in a battered thermos that steamed when Samuel unscrewed the lid. "Drink," he ordered, pouring cups for both of them. Slowly. Your systems are stressed enough without adding shock to the mix. The coffee was black and strong, and the most beautiful thing Harold had ever tasted. He felt the warmth spread through his chest, his stomach, his limbs, felt something like hope flicker back to life in the cold ashes of his heart. "Why?" he asked. Samuel looked up from where he was connecting the new propane tank to their stove. "Why what? Why are you helping us? You don't know us." Samuel was quiet for a moment. His hands continued their work, steady and sure, but his eyes had gone distant. "My wife," he said finally. "Eleanor. She passed 3 years ago. Breast cancer." He tightened a fitting, checked the connection. She had this saying. Used to drive me crazy, honestly. She'd say, "Samuel, strangers are just family you haven't met yet." He lit the stove. The blue flame caught immediately, strong and steady, and Harold felt tears prick his eyes at the simple sight of it. "I thought it was naive," Samuel continued. "Sentimental, the kind of thing people say when they haven't seen what the world can really do. But Eleanor, she meant it. Every word. She'd bring home strays, and not just dogs and cats. People, too. Folks who needed a meal, a place to stay, someone to listen." He smiled, but it was a sad smile, heavy with memory. She made our house feel like a train station sometimes, people coming and going, all of them touched by her kindness. She sounds remarkable, Evelyn said softly. She was, and after she died, I had a choice. I could let her goodness die with her, or I could try to carry it forward. Samuel met Harold's eyes. I patrol these roads twice a week, looking for exactly this. People who need help. People the world has forgotten. Do you do this regularly? More often than you'd think. These mountains, Samuel gestured toward the tent wall, toward the wilderness beyond. They attract people who've run out of options. Sometimes they're young folks, running from bad situations. Sometimes they're veterans who can't face the world anymore. And sometimes, he looked at Harold and Evelyn with those knowing eyes. Sometimes they're people like you. Good people who got thrown away by the ones they trusted most. Harold felt something shift in his chest. Not quite a breaking, that had already happened. More like settling. The recognition that their story wasn't unique. That they weren't alone in their betrayal. How did you know, he asked, that we didn't choose this? Samuel's smile was gentle. Brother, nobody chooses a summer tent in November. Not unless they've got nowhere else to go. Samuel stayed for 3 hours. He heated soup and watched them eat. He replaced their inadequate sleeping bags with thermal blankets. He gave Harold a bottle of blood pressure medication from his own supply. I've got plenty, he said when Harold tried to refuse. And your need is greater than mine. And he listened. The story came out slowly at first, then faster, like water finding its way through a cracked dam. Harold hadn't intended to tell all of it. He'd spent weeks burying the details, trying not to think about the specific ways his children had failed them. But Samuel listened without judgment, without interruption, and somehow the silence drew the words out. Derek, the eldest, the one who'd forged Harold's signature to sell the family home, pocketing the equity to cover debts from a failed business venture. The same business Harold had refinanced his mortgage to fund 20 years ago, when Derek was young and optimistic and promised his father that the loan was temporary, that he'd pay back every penny. He never did. Melissa, the daughter, the one who'd always been closest to Evelyn, who called every Sunday for 30 years straight, until Harold's stroke, until the medical bills started piling up, until helping her parents became inconvenient. The Sunday calls stopped first, then the birthday acknowledgments, then the response to any message at all. Her number had been disconnected for 2 months now. The twins, Marcus and Michael, they'd been the ones to suggest the assisted living facility, presenting it as a kindness when it was actually a cage. They'd promised to visit every week, to call every day, to make sure their parents were comfortable and cared for. 3 weeks. That's how long the visits lasted. Then the excuses started. Work commitments, family obligations, a vague illness that never quite cleared up. And when the facility called to say the payments had stopped, when Harold and Evelyn were given 48 hours to find somewhere else to go, the twins didn't answer their phones. Kyle, the youngest, the one who'd always been the most charming, the most promising, the golden child who'd parlayed his parents' sacrifices into a lucrative career and a lifestyle they could barely imagine. He'd been their last hope, the only one who'd bothered to return their calls, the only one who seemed to feel any guilt at all. And his solution had been this tent. He knew, Harold said, his voice rough. He knew what he was doing when he gave us this. He knew we wouldn't survive the winter. He just didn't want to be the one responsible for saying no directly. Let the mountains do it for him. Samuel was quiet for a long moment after Harold finished. The tent was warm now, the propane stove humming steadily, but the warmth couldn't reach the cold place where Harold kept his grief. I want to tell you something, Samuel said finally, and I want you to hear it, really hear it, because it's important. Harold looked up. What your children did, that's not on you. You didn't fail them. They failed themselves. Samuel's voice was firm but kind. I've seen this before. More times than I can count. Good parents, loving parents, who gave everything and got nothing back. And every single one of them asks the same question you're asking right now. What did I do wrong? Didn't I? No. You raised them with love. You sacrificed for them. You taught them right from wrong. What they chose to do with that teaching, that's on them. Not you. Evelyn was crying silently, tears tracking down her weathered cheeks. Harold reached for her hand. "It doesn't feel that way," she whispered. "I know," Samuel said. "It won't for a while, maybe not ever completely. But I'm going to tell you something else, and this one's a promise." He leaned forward, holding their eyes with his own. "You're not alone anymore. There are people in these mountains who look out for each other, who understand what it means to be forgotten by the world, and I'm going to connect you with them." "People?" Harold asked. "A community. Informal, mostly, but real. Folks like you who ended up out here for one reason or another and decided to survive together instead of alone." Samuel stood, his knees cracking. "I'm going to come back tomorrow with more supplies. And the day after that, if the roads are clear, I'm taking you somewhere warm." "We can't pay you," Harold said. "We don't have anything." Samuel's smile reached his eyes for the first time. "Brother, Eleanor didn't do what she did for payment. Neither do I." He pulled on his coat. "Get some rest. Eat. Stay warm. Tomorrow, things start getting better." He came back the next day, as promised, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each visit brought supplies, food, medicine, warm clothing that fit better than anything they'd owned in months. Samuel never made a production of it, never drew attention to his generosity. He simply arrived, unloaded whatever he'd brought, and sat with them while they ate. But more than the supplies, he brought something Harold hadn't realized he needed: conversation. Samuel told them about his life. 40 years as a forest ranger, walking these mountains in every season. The animals he'd encountered, the storms he'd survived, the quiet beauty of sunrise over snowfields that no photograph could capture. His marriage to Eleanor. 43 years of partnership that had ended too soon but left him richer than any amount of money could. And he told them about the community he'd mentioned. "Started about 15 years ago," Samuel explained. "Bunch of us who'd ended up out here for various reasons. Some lost their homes in the recession. Some were veterans who couldn't readjust. Some were just regular folks who got chewed up by a system that doesn't care about individuals." "How many?" Evelyn asked. "Varies. Right now, maybe 30, 40 permanent residents scattered across the mountain towns. Another couple dozen who come and go depending on circumstances." Samuel poured himself more coffee from the thermos he'd brought. "We look out for each other, share resources, help when there's helping to be done." "Sounds like a family," Harold said. "Better than most families I've seen," Samuel replied. "Nobody here judges, nobody here abandons. When you're in, and when you need help, you get it. No questions, no conditions." Harold thought about his own family, the conditions that had been placed on love. The way help had always come with strings attached, expectations to be met, debts to be repaid. "What would we have to do?" he asked. "To be part of this community?" Samuel smiled. "You're already doing it, surviving, refusing to give up, treating each other with kindness even when everything else has fallen apart." He set down his coffee cup. "That's the only requirement. Be a good person. Help when you can. Accept help when you need it. That's it. That's everything. The rest takes care of itself." On the 7th day, after Samuel first found them, the weather broke completely. The sky was crystalline blue, the snow glittering under a sun that actually held warmth. Harold stepped outside the tent and felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: the simple pleasure of a beautiful day. Samuel's truck appeared on the access road around mid-morning, but this time, he wasn't alone. A second vehicle followed him, a worn Subaru wagon with a ski rack on top and a bumper sticker that read, "Not all who wander are lost." Behind it came a third vehicle, a pickup even older than Samuel's, driven by a woman with gray hair pulled back in a practical braid. Harold watched them approach, his heart beating faster. Samuel climbed out of his truck and crossed to where Harold stood. His expression was serious but not grim. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, "before the others get here." "What is it?" "I made some calls. I talked to some people in town. There's a pastor at the Lutheran church, a man named Thomas. Good man, honest. He's got a cabin on his property that's been empty since his kids moved out. Samuel paused. He wants to offer it to you. Free and clear, for as long as you need it. Harold opened his mouth, but no words came out. It's small, Samuel continued. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a bathroom. But it's warm, it's safe, and it's yours. No rent, no conditions, just a place to live. Why? Harold finally managed. Why would a stranger do that? Because that's what we do out here. Samuel put his hand on Harold's shoulder. And because of your story, what your children did to you, it made people angry. Not at you, at the injustice of it. At the idea that anyone could treat their parents that way. The woman from the pickup had reached them now. She was in her late 50s, sun-weathered and capable-looking, with the kind of handshake that meant business. "I'm Ruth," she said. "Samuel told me about your situation. I'm a nurse, retired, mostly, but I still practice informally for folks who need it and can't afford the regular system." She looked Harold up and down with professional eyes. "You need to eat more. And I want to check your blood pressure before you go anywhere. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're a man recovering from a stroke who's been living in a canvas tent in November. Nobody in that situation is fine." She said it without judgment, just fact. "Let me help." The driver of the Subaru had joined them now, a younger man, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be doing something useful than standing around talking. "I'm James," he said. "I brought some things, clothes mostly, winter stuff that should fit both of you better than whatever you've got." He gestured toward his car. "There's food, too, and a portable heater for the cabin, in case the one that's there isn't enough." Harold looked at the 3 strangers who had materialized in his frozen clearing, at Samuel, who had found them when no one else was looking, at Ruth, already pulling supplies from her pickup with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before, at James, unloading boxes of clothing and canned goods without being asked. He thought about his children, about their empty promises and convenient forgetting, about the way they'd reduced 4 decades of parenting to an inconvenience, a problem to be solved with a tent and directions to the wilderness. And then he looked at these people, these strangers who owed him nothing, who had nothing to gain from helping, and felt something crack open in his chest. "I don't understand," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion he couldn't control. "I don't understand why you're doing this." Ruth stopped what she was doing and turned to face him. Her expression was soft in a way that reminded Harold of Eleanor, the wife Samuel had lost, who believed that strangers were just family you hadn't met yet. "Honey," Ruth said, "you don't need to understand it. You just need to accept it." She smiled. "That's the hardest part, I know, accepting help when you've spent your whole life being the one who helps. But you've earned this. You've earned kindness. And we're going to make sure you get it whether you understand why or not." Evelyn had emerged from the tent during the conversation. She stood beside Harold, taking in the scene, the vehicles, the supplies, the strangers who had become something else entirely. "Is this real?" she whispered. Harold put his arm around her, feeling her lean into him the way she had for 51 years. "I think so," he said. "I think it finally is." The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through pine trees like a secret being whispered from one mountain to the next. It was small, just as Samuel had described. White clapboard siding that needed paint, a green metal roof dusted with snow, a porch barely wide enough for 2 chairs. But smoke curled from the chimney, and warm light glowed behind curtained windows, and to Harold Mitchell, it looked like a palace. Pastor Thomas stood on the porch waiting. He was a tall man, thin in the way of people who forgot to eat when they were busy caring for others. His hair was white, and his face was lined, but his eyes held a gentleness that made Harold think of his own father, dead now for 30 years but never forgotten. "Welcome," Thomas said, stepping forward to shake Harold's hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "I'm Thomas. I've heard a bit about your situation, and I want you to know, this place is yours for as long as you need it. No strings, no expectations." Harold tried to find words. He'd been trying to find words for the entire drive from the campground, watching the frozen wilderness give way to scattered homes, then to something resembling a town, then back out to this quiet road where the cabin waited like an answer to a prayer he'd stopped believing in. "I don't know how to thank you," he finally managed. Thomas smiled. "You don't have to, that's the point." He gestured toward the door. "Come inside. It's warm. And Ruth tells me you both need warming up more than just about anything else right now." The interior was simple but complete. A main room with a wood stove already burning, flames visible through the glass door. A small kitchen with actual appliances, a refrigerator humming quietly, a stove with 4 burners, a microwave that looked like it came from the previous decade but probably still worked fine. 2 doors led off the main space, one to a bedroom with a real bed, a queen-size mattress covered in a quilt that someone had clearly made by hand, and one to a bathroom with a shower, a toilet, and running water. Running water. Harold hadn't realized how much he'd missed running water until he turned on the tap and watched it flow, clean and clear, into the sink. "The heater works," Thomas was explaining, "but the wood stove is more reliable in deep cold. I've got a cord of firewood stacked around back, and James is bringing more tomorrow." The refrigerator's stocked with basics: milk, eggs, bread, some vegetables. "Ruth's going to stop by later with medications for both of you." Evelyn stood in the middle of the main room, turning slowly, taking it all in. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, not exactly. She was doing something Harold had seen only a handful of times in their 51 years together. She was allowing herself to hope. "The quilt," she said softly, gesturing toward the bedroom. "Who made it?" Thomas's expression shifted, something tender moving behind his eyes. "My wife, Margaret. She passed 4 years ago. That was one of her last projects." He paused. "She would have wanted someone to use it, to be warm under it. She hated the idea of beautiful things going to waste." Evelyn crossed to the bedroom doorway and stood looking at the quilt for a long moment. Then she turned back to Thomas. "Thank you," she said. "I know those words aren't enough. I know there's nothing I can say that matches what you're giving us. But thank you." Thomas nodded. "You're welcome. Both of you." He moved toward the door. "I'll let you get settled. The church is about 2 miles down the main road if you ever want to visit, but there's no pressure. This isn't conditional on anything. It's just a place to be, a place to heal." After he left, Harold and Evelyn stood in the cabin's warmth and said nothing for a long time. There was nothing to say. The silence held everything: the grief, the gratitude, the disbelief that any of this was actually happening. Finally, Evelyn spoke. "I want to take a shower," she said. "A real shower, with hot water." Harold laughed. It came out rusty, unpracticed, but real. "Go," he said. "Take your time. I'll figure out the wood stove." She disappeared into the bathroom, and a moment later Harold heard the water start. He imagined her standing under the spray, letting the heat soak into her aching joints, washing away the cold and the fear and the residue of everything they'd endured. He added a log to the wood stove and sat in the chair nearest the warmth. For the first time in months, he let himself believe they might actually survive. Ruth arrived the next morning with a medical bag and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded Harold of the faith. Nurses at the VA hospital where he'd had his stroke evaluated. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to the kitchen chair she'd pulled into the center of the room. "I'm going to check everything: blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels. And I want to see your hands, Evelyn. Samuel told me about the arthritis." Harold sat. He'd learned in the past week that arguing with people who wanted to help was a waste of energy he didn't have. Ruth worked efficiently, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around his arm with practiced ease. Her brow furrowed as she watched the numbers climb. "When did you run out of your medication?" she asked. 9 days ago, maybe 10. And you've been managing on just what Samuel brought you?" "It was enough to keep me going." Ruth made a sound that suggested she disagreed. "Your pressure's high. Not dangerous, but higher than I'd like." She removed the cuff and reached into her bag. "I'm going to give you a 2-week supply of what you need. After that, We'll get you set up with Dr. Chen in town. He does sliding scale for folks who can't afford full price. We can't. Stop. Ruth held up her hand. I know what you're going to say. You can't afford it. You don't want charity. You've always paid your own way. I've heard it all before, Harold. Every single person who comes through here says the same thing. She fixed him with a stare that was stern but not unkind. Here's the truth. You paid your way for 74 years. You worked, you raised children, you contributed to a society that's now failing to take care of you. This isn't charity. It's what you're owed. It's what everyone is owed when they've given their whole life to doing the right thing. Harold opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. Good, Ruth said. Now let me see those hands, Evelyn. Evelyn extended her swollen fingers, and Ruth examined them with the same careful attention she'd given Harold's blood pressure. Her expression grew more serious as she manipulated each joint, watching Evelyn's face for signs of pain. How long since you've had proper treatment for this? Months, Evelyn admitted. The medication was expensive, and after we lost the house, you stopped taking it. There wasn't money for everything. Harold needed his blood pressure pills more than I needed. Stop right there. Ruth's voice was firm. You don't get to sacrifice your health for his, and he doesn't get to sacrifice his for yours. That's not how this works. You're both important. You both deserve care. She reached into her bag again. I'm going to start you on something that should help with the inflammation. It's not a cure, but it'll make moving easier. And I want you both doing gentle exercises. Nothing strenuous, just enough to keep the blood flowing. I'll show you some before I leave. For the next hour, Ruth taught them stretches and movements designed for aging bodies in cold climates. She showed Harold how to monitor his own blood pressure, using a cuff she'd brought as a gift. She demonstrated massage techniques that Evelyn could use on her own hands when the pain got bad. And she talked. She told them about herself. 25 years as an ER nurse in Denver, burnout that nearly destroyed her marriage, the decision to move to the mountains and start over. She told them about the community Samuel had mentioned, the informal network of people helping people that had grown up in these forgotten towns. It started with just a few of us, she explained. Samuel and Eleanor, me and my husband before he passed, a couple of veterans who'd found their way up here after Iraq. We'd share meals, check on each other during storms, pool resources when someone was running low. She smiled. Then word got out. People started showing up, folks like you, who'd been thrown away by the system or by their own families. And we just kept helping, kept growing. How many people? Harold asked. Hard to say exactly. The core group is maybe 40, 50 people scattered across 3 or 4 towns, but there are others on the edges, folks who come and go, who need help for a season and then move on, or who stick around and become part of the family. Ruth began packing up her supplies. You're part of that family now, whether you feel like it or not. You'll meet more of them in the coming weeks. After she left, Harold sat in the warmth of the cabin and thought about the word she'd used. Family. His real family, the one he'd created, raised, and sacrificed for, had thrown him away like garbage. They'd taken everything he had and left him with nothing. They'd watched him and Evelyn walk toward almost certain death and done nothing to stop it. But these strangers, these people who owed him nothing, who had no obligation to care whether he lived or died, they'd welcomed him without hesitation, fed him, housed him, treated his medical conditions, called him family. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it made sense. And yet, here he was, warm and safe, with medicine in his system and food in his stomach and a bed waiting for him that didn't smell like mildew and desperation. Maybe sense wasn't the point. Maybe kindness didn't have to make sense to be real. The weeks that followed were quiet, not empty. There was always something happening, someone stopping by, some small task that needed doing, but quiet in the way that healing requires. Space to breathe, room to think, time to let the wounds begin to close. Harold fell into a routine. He woke each morning before dawn, added wood to the stove, and made coffee in the old percolator he'd found in one of the kitchen cabinets. He'd sit by the window and watch the light change over the mountains, the sky shifting from black to purple to pink to gold. He'd think about nothing in particular, letting his mind wander wherever it wanted to go. Sometimes it went to dark places. To Derek's betrayal, to Melissa's silence, to the twins' broken promises, and Kyle's murderous gift. He'd feel the anger rise up in his chest, hot and bitter. And he'd let it burn for a while before consciously setting it aside. What good was anger now? It couldn't change what had happened. It couldn't make his children into the people he'd raised them to be. It could only poison whatever time he had left, and he decided, without quite realizing he'd decided, that he didn't want to spend that time being angry. So he'd let the anger go, morning by morning, and focus instead on what was in front of him. The coffee cooling in his hands, the fire crackling in the stove. Evelyn's breathing, soft and steady, from the bedroom where she still slept. She was getting better. The medication Ruth had provided was working, reducing the swelling in her joints, giving her back mobility she'd lost months ago. She'd started cooking again, nothing elaborate, just simple meals that reminded Harold of their early years together, when money was tight but love was abundant. Soup and fresh bread, eggs scrambled with whatever vegetables were on hand. Coffee cake made from a recipe her mother had passed down 3 generations. "I forgot how much I missed this," she told him one evening, standing at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand. "Having a kitchen, having a home." "Me too," Harold said. "Do you think," she paused, stirring something that smelled like onions and garlic, "do you think we can stay here, really stay?" It was a question Harold had been asking himself for weeks. Pastor Thomas had said the cabin was theirs for as long as they needed it, but what did that mean? A month? A year? Until Thomas decided he needed the space for someone else? "I don't know," he admitted. "I hope so. I'd like to plant a garden in the spring," Evelyn said softly. "If we're still here, there's that patch of ground by the south side of the cabin that gets good sun. I could grow tomatoes, maybe some beans, herbs for cooking." Harold looked at her. This woman he'd loved for more than half a century, who had weathered every storm beside him, who had been betrayed by her own children and nearly died in a frozen tent, but was still talking about gardens and spring and the future. "We'll be back here," he said. "I'll make sure of it." Dr. Chen's office was in a converted house on the main street of town, sandwiched between a hardware store and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since 1975. The doctor himself was younger than Harold, expected, maybe 45, with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm manner that put Harold immediately at ease. "Ruth told me about your situation," Dr. Chen said, reviewing Harold's medical file with focused attention. "Stroke 8 months ago, high blood pressure, some residual weakness on the left side. How are you feeling now?" "Better," Harold said honestly. "Better than I've felt in months." "That's good. Stress and exposure can do a number on cardiovascular health, especially post-stroke. The fact that you're recovering is a good sign." Dr. Chen set down the file. "I want to do some baseline tests today. Blood work, EKG, the usual." "Ruth mentioned you're worried about cost." Harold nodded. The worry was constant, a background hum that never quite went away. "Here's what we're going to do," Dr. Chen said. "I operate on a sliding scale for patients without insurance or resources. Based on your situation, your fee for today's visit is 0. Future visits, we'll reassess, but I don't expect it'll ever be more than you can manage. I can't ask you to work for free." "You're not asking. I'm offering," Dr. Chen smiled. "I grew up poor, Harold. My parents were immigrants who worked 3 jobs between them just to keep food on the table. Every doctor I saw as a kid, every teacher who helped me, every person who gave me a chance I hadn't earned, they're the reason I'm here now. This is how I pay that forward." Harold felt the familiar sting behind his eyes that came whenever someone was unexpectedly kind. He was learning, slowly, to accept these moments without fighting them, to let the kindness in instead of deflecting it with protests and pride. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome. Now let's get those tests done." The story appeared in the Mountain Herald 3 weeks after Harold and Evelyn moved into the cabin. Samuel had mentioned something about spreading the word, but Harold hadn't understood what that meant until Ruth showed up one morning with a newspaper tucked under her arm and a peculiar expression on her face. "You might want to see this," she said. The headline read, "Local community rallies around elderly couple abandoned by family." Below it was a photograph Harold didn't remember being taken. Him and Evelyn standing on the cabin's porch, the mountains rising behind them, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and gratitude. The article told their story, all of it. The 42 years of sacrifice, the children who'd promised to always be there, the house sold out from under them, the assisted living facility that had ejected them when payments stopped, Kyle's tent and the frozen campground where Samuel had found them dying. It quoted Pastor Thomas, "These are good people who were failed by the ones they trusted most. Our community doesn't let that kind of injustice stand." It quoted Dr. Chen, "The Mitchells represent a growing crisis in America. Elderly people discarded by family members who see them as inconveniences rather than human beings worthy of dignity and care." It quoted Ruth, "They were 3 days from death when Samuel found them, maybe less. The hypothermia had already set in. If he'd been a week later, even a few days, we'd be planning a funeral instead of a welcome party." And it quoted Evelyn, words Harold didn't remember her saying but recognized as perfectly hers. "We spent our whole lives believing that family meant everything. We were wrong. Family is the people who show up when you need them. By that definition, our children were never our family at all." Harold read the article 3 times. Then he set the paper down and stared at the wall for a long time. "Are you okay?" Ruth asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "I didn't expect this to become public. I know. And if you want, we can ask the paper not to run any follow-up stories. This was a one-time thing, meant to let the community know about your situation so more people could help." Ruth paused. "But there's something else you should probably know." "What?" "The story's been picked up by some bigger outlets. State papers, a couple of news websites. Samuel got a call from a TV station in Denver, asking if they could do an interview." Harold felt his chest tighten. The attention, the exposure, it was overwhelming. He'd spent his whole life being invisible, working hard, staying quiet, not making waves. The idea of his story being broadcast to thousands of strangers made him want to retreat into the cabin and never come out. But there was something else, too, something that flickered in the back of his mind like a distant light. His children, they would see this. They would see what they'd done, laid out in black and white for everyone to read. They would have to face the consequences of their abandonment, not in private where it could be denied and forgotten, but in public where the whole world could judge. Part of Harold, the part that still felt the anger, the betrayal, the bone-deep hurt of being thrown away by his own flesh and blood, wanted that, wanted them to feel shame, wanted them to understand what they'd done. But another part, the part that had learned to let go during those quiet mornings by the wood stove, wondered if public humiliation would change anything, if it would make his children better people or just angrier ones. If revenge, even passive revenge, was worth the cost to his own soul. "What do you want to do?" Ruth asked gently. Harold looked at Evelyn, who had been reading the article over his shoulder. Her expression was complicated, hurt and pride, and something that might have been satisfaction, all mixed together in a way that was hard to untangle. "What do you think?" he asked her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. "I think our story might help someone else. Some other parent who's being thrown away by their children. Some other couple who thinks they're alone." She met his eyes. "We're not alone. We know that now. Maybe if other people see our story, they'll know it too." Harold considered this. The idea that their suffering might have purpose, that it might illuminate a path for someone else walking through the same darkness, was not one that had occurred to him before. "Okay," he said finally. "We'll do the interview, but I want to control what we say. I don't want it to be about revenge or blame. I want it to be about survival, about community, about finding family in unexpected places." Ruth smiled. "I'll let Samuel know. He'll handle the media stuff. He's better at that than anyone else I know." After she left, Harold and Evelyn sat together in the quiet cabin. The newspapers spread between them like evidence of a crime and a miracle all at once. "Do you think they'll see it?" Evelyn asked. "Derek and Melissa and the twins and Kyle?" "Probably," Harold said. "What do you think they'll do?" Harold thought about his children, about the people they'd become, selfish, short-sighted, capable of cruelty he never would have believed when they were young. He thought about the choices they'd made and the ones they would make in the future. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'm done worrying about it. I'm done carrying them. They made their choices. Now they have to live with them." He put his arm around Evelyn and pulled her close. "We have a new family now," he said, "and that's the one I want to focus on." Outside, the mountains stood watch as they always had, patient and eternal. The snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing dark earth beneath, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing, the first sign of spring pushing back against winter's grip. Inside the cabin, Harold and Evelyn sat together in the warmth, letting the past recede and the future take shape. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And this time, they wouldn't be alone. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late March. Harold was outside splitting firewood, something Dr. Chen had cleared him to do in moderation, and something that made him feel useful in a way he hadn't felt in months. The rhythm of it was meditative. Lift, swing, crack, lift, swing, crack. Each split log was proof that his body still worked, that he was still capable of providing, even if what he was providing was just warmth for himself and Evelyn. He heard the phone ringing inside the cabin, the landline that Pastor Thomas had insisted on installing. "For emergencies and for connection," he'd said. Harold set down the axe and walked inside, his breath visible in the cold air. Evelyn had already answered. She stood in the kitchen with the receiver pressed to her ear, her face pale, her free hand gripping the counter like she needed it to stay upright. "Yes," she was saying. "Yes, I understand." "No, She looked up as Harold entered, and something in her expression made his stomach drop. "He's here now. I'll tell him." She hung up without saying goodbye. "Who was that?" Harold asked. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then she said a name Harold hadn't heard spoken aloud in months. "Derek." The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the cabin's peaceful air. Derek, their eldest son, the one who had forged Harold's signature, sold their home, taken everything they had, and left them with nothing. "What did he want?" "He's coming here," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady, but Harold could see the tremor in her hands. "Tomorrow." He said he saw the news story. He said, she paused, swallowing hard. He said he wants to talk, to explain. Harold felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger, exactly. He'd let most of the anger go over the past months, released it morning by morning like steam escaping from a kettle. But something else remained, a wariness, a protective instinct that had nothing to do with himself and everything to do with Evelyn. "Do you want to see him?" he asked. Evelyn considered the question, really considered it, the way she always did with important things. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to slam the door in his face. But another part," she trailed off. "Another part wants answers," Harold finished. "Yes," he crossed to her and took her hands in his. They were warmer now than they'd been in that frozen tent. The medication and the warmth and the care had done their work, but they still trembled. "Then we'll see him," Harold said, "together. And whatever he has to say, we'll listen. But we don't owe him anything, Evie. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not a second chance. We listen, and then we decide what comes next." She nodded slowly. "Okay, and I'm calling Samuel. I want him here when Derek arrives." "You think there'll be trouble?" Harold thought about his son, about the man Derek had become. Desperate, selfish, capable of betrayal Harold never would have imagined. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'd rather have backup and not need it than need it and not have it." Samuel arrived the next morning, an hour before Derek was scheduled to appear. He brought coffee and pastries from the diner in town, and he brought something else too, a quiet, steady presence that made Harold feel less alone in what was coming. "You don't have to do this. You know, Samuel said as they sat on the porch, watching the road. "You don't owe that boy anything, not after what he did." "I know," Harold said, "but Evelyn needs answers. And maybe," he paused, searching for the right words, "maybe I need to see who he's become. To know if there's anything left of the son I raised, or if that person is gone completely." Samuel nodded slowly. "I understand that. Just remember, whatever he says, whatever excuses he makes, you get to decide how you respond. You're not trapped anymore, brother. You have choices now. You have people who'll stand with you no matter what." "Brother." The word still caught Harold off guard sometimes. Samuel used it naturally, without self-consciousness, the way you'd address someone you'd known your whole life rather than someone you'd met in a frozen clearing 4 months ago. But that was the strange alchemy of what they'd built here, this community of forgotten people. Time moved differently when every day was a gift you hadn't expected to receive. 4 months could feel like 4 decades, when each one was filled with kindness you'd stopped believing was possible. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted Harold's thoughts. A car was coming up the road, new, expensive, completely out of place on this mountain, where most vehicles were older than their drivers' marriages. "That's him," Harold said, standing. The car pulled up in front of the cabin and stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and Derek stepped out. He looked older than Harold remembered. Thinner, too, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that manifested in the way he couldn't quite stand still. He was wearing a suit, the kind of suit that cost more than Harold had ever earned in a month, but it was rumpled, like he'd slept in it. "Dad," Derek said, his voice cracked on the single syllable. Harold said nothing. He waited. Derek's eyes moved from Harold to Samuel to the cabin behind them. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or discomfort at seeing his parents in circumstances so different from what he'd expected. "Can we talk?" Derek asked. "Please. I know I don't deserve it, but come inside," Harold said. Not warmly, but not cruelly either. Just a statement of fact, an invitation that was also a test. Derek followed them into the cabin. Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She didn't stand when Derek entered. She didn't speak. "Mom," Derek said. His voice broke again, and Harold saw tears gathering in his son's eyes. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so—" "Sit down," Evelyn said quietly. "And tell us why you're here." Derek sat. Samuel took up a position near the door, not threatening, just present. A witness to whatever was about to unfold. For a long moment, no one spoke. The wood stove crackled. Wind whispered against the windows. The cabin held its breath. Then Derek began to talk. The story came out in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror being assembled one shard at a time. The business failure that had started everything, not the first one, the one Harold had helped him recover from 20 years ago, but a second one, bigger, more catastrophic. Debts that had accumulated in secret, hidden from his wife, his siblings, his parents. "I was going to fix it," Derek said, his voice hollow. "I had a plan. I just needed capital to get back on my feet. And the house, your house, it was just sitting there, appreciating in value while you were in the assisted living facility. I told myself it was a loan, that I'd pay you back with interest once the business recovered. You forged my signature," Harold said flatly. Derek flinched. "Yes, you stole our home. The place where we raised you. The place where your mother planted the garden she'd tended for 30 years. I know. I know what I did. I've been living with it every day since. Have you?" Evelyn's voice was ice. "Have you really been living with it? Because from where I sat, in that freezing tent your brother gave us, waiting to die, it didn't seem like anyone was living with anything. It seemed like we'd been erased, like we didn't exist anymore." Derek put his head in his hands. His shoulders shook with sobs that might have been genuine or might have been performance. Harold couldn't tell anymore, couldn't trust his ability to read the child he'd raised. "I saw the news story," Derek said through his tears. "I saw what happened to you, what I did to you, and I couldn't." He looked up, his face wet and ravaged. "I couldn't live with myself. I had to come. I had to try to make it right. How? Harold asked. How do you make something like this right? You can't give us back the house. You can't give us back the months we spent thinking we were going to die. You can't give us back the trust we had in our own children. I can try. I can. Derek reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. I brought money, everything I could scrape together. It's not much compared to what I took, but it's a start. And I'll keep paying every month until— We don't want your money, Evelyn said. Derek looked stricken. Then what? What can I do? There has to be something. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had changed, still cold, but with something else beneath it, something that sounded almost like exhaustion. Do you know what the hardest part was? She asked. It wasn't the cold. It wasn't the hunger. It wasn't even the fear of dying. She met Derek's eyes with a gaze that could have cut glass. It was knowing that our own children had decided we weren't worth saving, that 42 years of love and sacrifice meant nothing to you, that you could look at your father and me and see nothing but inconvenience. That's not— I never meant, but you did. All of you. Derek with his theft, Melissa with her silence, the twins with their broken promises, Kyle with his death sentence disguised as a gift. Evelyn's voice finally cracked. We gave you everything. Everything. And you threw us away like we were garbage. The cabin fell silent. Derek sat with his head bowed, tears dripping onto his expensive suit. Harold watched his son and tried to feel something— anger, pity, forgiveness, anything, but found only emptiness. It was Samuel who finally spoke. I'm going to say something, he said, his voice gentle but firm, and then I'm going to step outside and let you folks work this out. Derek looked up, startled by the stranger's intervention. I've lived in these mountains for 40 years, Samuel continued. I've seen a lot of people come through here, broken people, desperate people, people who've done terrible things and people who've had terrible things done to them. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Forgiveness isn't about the person who hurt you, it's about you, about whether you want to carry that weight for the rest of your life, or whether you want to set it down. He looked at Harold, then at Evelyn. You don't owe this man anything. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, not a second chance. But you do owe yourselves peace. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, peace comes from letting go of the anger, even when it's justified. He moved toward the door. I'll be on the porch if you need me. The door closed behind him, leaving Harold and Evelyn alone with their son. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Derek talked about his failures, not just the business, but all of it. The marriage that was crumbling under the weight of secrets. The children who barely knew their grandparents because Derek had been too ashamed of his own inadequacy to facilitate the relationship. The drinking that had gotten worse over the past year. The mornings he woke up hating himself. The nights he spent wondering if his parents had survived the winter. I told myself you'd be fine, he admitted, that you'd figure something out, that you were survivors, and you'd land on your feet the way you always did. I told myself all kinds of lies because facing the truth was too hard. Harold listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue, didn't offer comfort. He just listened, and slowly something strange began to happen. The emptiness he'd felt when Derek first arrived began to fill, not with forgiveness, exactly, but with something more complicated. Understanding, maybe. Recognition of the weakness that had driven his son to betrayal. Awareness that the child he'd raised was still in there somewhere, buried beneath layers of shame and fear and self-destruction. It didn't make what Derek did okay. Nothing could make that okay. But it made it human, explicable. The result of choices that were terrible but comprehensible. When Derek finally ran out of words, Evelyn spoke. I can't forgive you, she said. Not today, maybe not ever. You need to understand that. Derek nodded miserably. But I can tell you this, I don't want to hate you anymore. Hating you takes energy I don't have. It takes space in my heart that I'd rather fill with something else. She reached across the table and, for the first time, touched her son's hand. I'm not going to pretend everything is okay. It's not okay. But I'm also not going to carry this anger around like a stone in my chest until it kills me. What does that mean? Derek asked. For us? For the future? Harold answered. It means we take it slow. You don't get to walk back into our lives like nothing happened. But if you're serious about making amends, real amends, not just money, then maybe, over time, we can build something new. I am serious. I swear I am. Then prove it, not with promises, with actions. Harold stood, signaling that the conversation was over. You can start by being honest with your siblings. Tell them what happened here today. Tell them that their parents survived despite everything they did to ensure otherwise. And tell them that, if they ever want a relationship with us again, they know where to find us. Derek stood too, his movements uncertain. Can I come back to visit? Harold looked at Evelyn. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. In a few months, Harold said. Call first. And Derek, he caught his son's eyes and held them. If you ever lie to us again about anything, you'll never see us again. That's not a threat. It's a fact. I understand. Good. Now go home. Fix your marriage. Be a better father than you've been a son. And maybe we can figure out the rest. Derek left. Harold and Evelyn stood on the porch with Samuel, watching the expensive car disappear down the mountain road. You did well, Samuel said quietly. Both of you. Evelyn leaned against Harold's shoulder. I don't know if I did well or not. I just did what felt right. That's usually the same thing, Samuel replied. Spring came to the mountains like a promise finally kept. The snow retreated up the peaks, revealing meadows that erupted into wildflowers almost overnight. The birds returned, first the robins, then the bluebirds, then the hummingbirds that would hover around the feeder Evelyn had hung outside the kitchen window. The air warmed, not dramatically, but enough that morning walks no longer required 3 layers of clothing. Harold and Evelyn settled into their new life with a contentment that still surprised them both. The garden Evelyn had dreamed about became real. Tomatoes and beans and herbs, just as she'd hoped, growing in the sunny patch beside the cabin. Harold built raised beds to make the work easier on her knees, and she spent hours each day tending her plants with a care that bordered on devotion. This is what I always wanted, she told Harold one evening, dirt under her fingernails and satisfaction on her face. A simple life, good people around us, work that means something. We could have had it sooner, Harold said, if we hadn't spent so many years trying to give the kids everything we didn't have. Maybe. But then we wouldn't appreciate it the way we do now. She smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what you actually need. The community that had saved them became their family in ways that went beyond metaphor. Ruth stopped by twice a week to check on their health and share gossip from town. Dr. Chen became not just their physician but their friend, joining them for dinner occasionally and discussing everything from politics to philosophy over Evelyn's cooking. James, the nervous young man who'd brought them clothes that first day, turned out to be an excellent chess player, and he and Harold developed a weekly game that Harold looked forward to more than he'd admit. And Samuel became something Harold had never expected to have again, a brother. Not by blood, but by choice. By the bond that forms between two people who've seen each other at their worst and decided to stay anyway. They fished together in the streams that ran down from the mountains. They worked on projects around Samuel's property and Harold's cabin. They sat on porches as the sun went down and talked about their wives, Eleanor, who had believed in the goodness of strangers, and Evelyn, who had survived betrayal and emerged stronger. Eleanor would have loved your wife, Samuel said one evening. 2 peas in a pod, I think. Both of them too stubborn to give up on anything. Harold laughed. Evelyn would say the same about her. Maybe that's why this all worked out. Maybe Eleanor and God and whoever else is up there decided that you two needed this place, and we needed you. Samuel took a sip of his coffee. I don't believe in coincidences, brother. Never have. Things happen for reasons, even when we can't see them. Harold thought about that night in the tent, the cold that had seeped into his bones. The certainty that he and Evelyn were going to die there, forgotten and alone. And then Samuel's voice, calling through the storm. "Hello? Anyone here?" "Maybe you're right," Harold said. "Maybe this was always supposed to happen. Or maybe we just got lucky." Samuel smiled. "Either way, I'm grateful you're here." "Me too." The other children came eventually, not all at once, and not without resistance. But the story Derek told them, the story of their parents' survival, of the community that had saved them, of the confrontation in the cabin, worked its way through the family like water through cracks in stone. Melissa called first. Her voice was small and scared, nothing like the confident woman Harold remembered from before his stroke. She cried through most of the conversation, apologizing for things Harold had almost forgotten, for silences that had stretched into chasms. "I didn't know what to say," she admitted. "After everything went wrong, I just froze. I couldn't face what was happening to you, so I pretended it wasn't happening." "I know that's not an excuse." "No," Harold agreed. "It's not. Can I try again? Can we try again?" Harold looked at Evelyn, who was listening on the extension. She nodded slowly. "We can try," he said. "But it's going to take time, Melissa. A lot of time. I understand. I'll wait, however long it takes." The twins came next, together as always. They drove up from Denver on a Saturday in June, arriving at the cabin with nervous expressions and arms full of gifts that Harold didn't want but accepted anyway because refusing would have cost more energy than it was worth. The conversation with them was harder. Marcus and Michael had always operated as a unit, reinforcing each other's decisions, sharing blame in a way that diffused individual responsibility, getting them to acknowledge what they'd done, really acknowledge it, not just offer the empty apologies they'd learned to deploy like shields, took hours of difficult conversation. But eventually, something cracked. "We thought we were helping," Marcus admitted, his voice raw. "The assisted living facility. We really did think it was the best option. We didn't know they were going to stop paying." "We didn't know. You didn't know because you stopped asking," Evelyn interrupted. "You made a decision about our lives without asking what we wanted, and then you walked away and assumed everything would be fine. That's not helping. That's abandoning." The twins had no response to that. There was no response, but they listened. They stayed. They asked questions about the cabin, the community, the life their parents had built from the ashes of everything the children had destroyed. And when they left, there was something different in the air between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of forgiveness. A door cracked open instead of sealed shut. Kyle never came. He sent a letter, eventually. A single page of carefully worded non-apology that acknowledged mistakes were made and expressed hope that healing could occur without Gendon ever actually admitting what he had done. Harold read it once, then threw it in the wood stove and watched it burn. "Some people don't change," Samuel said when Harold told him about the letter. "Some people can't see past themselves long enough to understand the damage they've done. That's not your fault, and it's not your responsibility to fix." "I know," Harold said, "but he was my son. Part of me will always wish things were different. That's because you're a good father. Good fathers never stop loving their children, even when those children don't deserve it." Samuel put a hand on Harold's shoulder. "But loving someone doesn't mean you have to let them hurt you. You can love Kyle from a distance and still protect yourself from his selfishness." Harold nodded. It was a lesson he was still learning, the difference between love and acceptance, between hope and enabling. But he was learning it. Day by day, he was learning. A year after Samuel found them in that frozen clearing, the Mountain Herald ran a follow-up story. "Abandoned couple thrives 1 year later," the headline read. "Mitchells build new life in mountain community." The article featured a photograph of Harold and Evelyn standing in their garden, surrounded by tomato plants and bean poles, and the vibrant evidence of a life rebuilt from nothing. They were smiling, real smiles, the kind that came from somewhere deep inside, and Harold barely recognized himself in the image. He looked happy, healthy, whole. The article talked about the community support system that had grown around them, the informal network of mutual aid that Samuel had started and that Harold and Evelyn had helped expand. It mentioned the other seniors they'd helped over the past year, the veterans they'd welcomed, the lost souls who'd found their way to these mountains and discovered that they weren't as alone as they'd believed. "What's the quarter door? Secret?" the reporter had asked during the interview. Harold had thought about the question for a long time before answering. "There's no secret," he finally said. "It's just people deciding to take care of each other, deciding that strangers are worth saving, deciding that kindness matters more than convenience." He'd paused, remembering Eleanor's words as Samuel had shared them. "Strangers are just family you haven't met yet. We spent our whole lives believing that blood family was everything," Harold continued. "That the people you created, raised, and sacrificed for would always be there when you needed them. We were wrong about that, but we were right about the deeper thing, the thing underneath." "What's that?" the reporter asked. "That nobody survives alone, that we need each other. That the measure of a life isn't what you accumulate, but who you lift up along the way." Harold had looked at Evelyn then, at this woman who'd walked through fire with him and emerged stronger. Our children forgot that lesson. But we found people who remembered it, and that made all the difference. On the anniversary of the night Samuel found them, Harold and Evelyn hosted a gathering at the cabin. Everyone came, Samuel and Ruth and Dr. Chen and James and Pastor Thomas, and a dozen others who'd become part of their extended family over the past year. They brought food and drinks and stories, filling the small cabin with warmth and laughter and the unmistakable energy of people who genuinely cared about each other. Harold stood on the porch as the sun set, watching the light paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink and purple. Evelyn came to stand beside him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "A year ago tonight, I thought we were going to die." "I know. Me too. And now." He gestured at the cabin, the people inside, the life they'd built. "Now I think maybe we're more alive than we've ever been." Evelyn smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "Funny how that works, isn't it? Losing everything, only to find what we actually needed." "I wouldn't recommend the method." "No," she agreed. "But I wouldn't trade the result." Inside, someone started playing guitar. Voices joined in, rough and imperfect but full of joy. The sound drifted out through the open windows, mixing with the evening bird song and the whisper of wind through pine trees. Harold put his arm around Evelyn and held her close. "I love you," he said. "I know," she replied. "I've always known." They stood together in the fading light, surrounded by the family they'd found when the family they'd made had failed them. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warmth. Before them, the mountains stood eternal, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful nonetheless. They had lost everything. And in losing everything, they had discovered what mattered most. Not blood, not obligation, not the transactions that masquerade as love. Just people, showing up, staying. That was family. That was enough.